Hi, everyone. I'm Justine Clark, and I'm a co-founder and director of Parlour. And this series, Light at the End of the Tunnel, is a collaboration between Parlour and Monash Architecture. Once again, my colleague Naomi is not with us today, but we are very fortunate to have Alison Cleary in the co-chair seat today. Naomi will be coming back eventually. We just have to, wait for her. So we acknowledge the traditional owners of country across Australia's many nations and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. In particular, we acknowledge the people of the Greater Kulin Nations, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which Monash operates and on which many of us are speaking to you from today. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to the Indigenous Australians who are part of the Parlour community. So welcome, number 20. In the Light at the End of the Tunnel session, our series looking into architecture as a profession, a discipline and a practice, how it will and is and will be affected by the pandemic, and how we might influence what our profession looks like once we emerge at the other end of this long tunnel. So today's session looks at negotiation, and we're very fortunate to have Peter Gahan here to offer insight and advice. And Alison will introduce Peter shortly. But first, some protocols for those of you who haven't joined us before. Please do make sure that your microphone's on mute unless you're actually speaking. But if you can, please do leave your camera on. We really enjoy seeing that kind of mosaic of faces and having a sense that we are all here together at an event. So these events are informal but informative. Alison and I will ask questions of Peter throughout and keep things flowing, but we're also very keen to have questions from the floor. So if you have got a question, please put it into the chat function. Our colleague Susie will be keeping an eye on them, and we will ask then throw to specific people to pose their questions verbally. If you can't do that, let us know in the chat, and we will also, we're happy to put that question ourselves. We can never get to all the questions, but they do really help inform what we do next, and it's really just very interesting to hear all of your experiences. There's often a really wonderful parallel conversation that happens in that chat function. So again, please feel free to enter your observations, comments, whatever it is that you would like to add to the conversation. But do be aware that if you're talking about a specific example or experience and it's negative, it's probably best not to name the practice or the individuals involved. That will protect you, and it will also protect us. So Alison, would you like to introduce your friend Peter, please?
Thanks, Justine. I would love to introduce my friend Peter. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Alison Cleary. I'm also a director of Parlour and currently exiting as the executive director of Open House Melbourne, where I've been for the last 9 months, steering the ship through COVID. Peter Gahan is a very old friend, very dear friend of mine. We've known each other well before Peter became a professor and before I became an executive director of anything. But Peter's background is very much immersed in workplace leadership and workplace issues. He's currently the Professor of Management at the University of Melbourne and Associate Dean of Engagement there for the Faculty of Business and Economics. And in 2012, he founded the Centre for Workplace Leadership at the university. He's also previously held positions in Australia at UNSW, Monash, and also across, well, I'm reading this, very impressive, Peter, across the world at the University of Southern California, European University Institute, Cardiff Business School, New York University, and Stockholm Business School. He's published extensively on negotiation and bargaining, leadership, high-performance systems, work-life conflict, human resource management, and is currently engaged in 2 projects investigating how digital technologies are transforming work and leadership and the challenges for leadership and human resource management. This is an issue dear to my heart, Peter, associated with an ageing workforce and age diversity. He hasn't just had a life in academia, for those of you thinking he may not really know what the real world is like. He has worked outside academia as a senior public servant in the Victorian state government in workplace innovation, and has done commissioned research for a number of Commonwealth and state government departments. He also runs marathons, just so you know, he does do something outside of work. So, Peter, negotiations. I think probably we could start with the fundamentals. What are the absolute basics of effective negotiation?
Well, I reckon there are probably three really important fundamentals that are important to remember and also to remind yourself of as often as you can. The first is around just doing your homework, being prepared for a negotiation. And by that I mean it's about thinking through what you see as your own sort of goals, your own interests and priorities that need to be served in the negotiation. You need to do the same thing for the other party. And this will be something, I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit more detail, but part of your job is to understand the other party and help them get what they want out of the negotiation as well. So you need to understand what their own underlying interests, concerns and priorities might be. And then you've got to understand the situation. So what's the mix of issues? Where do you see some of the conflicts that might be arising or differences between the parties that will focus the negotiation? Where do you see the overlap in interests such that you can begin to find points of agreement and across which you can trade? And then I suppose the other things, are there particular legal constraints or other types of obligations in the way you negotiate? So all those three things are really important to preparing for negotiation. And in a whole bunch of studies done going back to the 1980s, preparation turned out to be one of the strongest predictors of how successful negotiators were in these clinical or laboratory type negotiation experiments. So it turns out to be extremely important. The second is, I think often when we look at negotiation, we're influenced by, I reckon, TV shows, and I like watching them like Suits and so on, where you see negotiations happen all the time. And it's often about making strong demands and a line in the sand and having a position in the negotiation. Whereas in fact, the research tells us that you need, rather than focus on demands and positions, trying to think about what might be the underlying interests that are actually motivating those demands in the first place is much better. And it opens the conversation up to begin thinking about options that might be different to those demands that are there, but in fact might make both parties better off in the negotiated agreement. And the third bit, which often feels sort of counterintuitive in some ways, it's part of the preparation, it's having a strong idea of what you would do if you couldn't negotiate. So what's your alternatives to a negotiated agreement? And the stronger those alternatives are, the more confidence you can take into the negotiation. And in fact, the better you can perform and the better deal you can get out of the negotiation. Of course, if things go pear-shaped, you've actually got other options to work with. So thinking about alternatives to negotiating this deal with this person or these parties, it may be with other parties, or it might be a non-negotiated type arrangement that you're entering into. But having a clear idea of those as you go into the negotiation actually helps you a lot in the process of negotiating.
Okay, so on the flip side to that, if they're the three key things that you need to be doing, what are, say, the three common mistakes that people then do when they're going in?
Okay, well, and this is the problem, is that there are probably more common errors to talk about than there are sort of common sort of core principles that might be useful for effective negotiation. But there are some. So the first is around mindset. So being very conscious of the mindset you take into a negotiation. So we've all heard of this idea of unconscious bias, and psychologists and other behavioralists have uncovered a whole bunch of cognitive biases that we take into different types of social situations, and it's the same in negotiation. So negotiators often take one of two mindsets in that actually are detrimental to how they perform. The first is what's called a fixed pie mindset. That is, they go into the negotiation thinking it's a competition and it's all about them. So it's all about them getting what they want out of the negotiation. And when they do that and they focus only on their own needs, then they often forget to identify and explore opportunities that meet the other party's interests, but in fact may be just as good for them or even better for them in terms of the outcome. So they close off possibilities by having this fixed pie mindset. And the other one is where and it's more typical with people who find dealing with conflict situations more challenging, and it's where that they look to cooperate at all costs. So cooperating at all costs means that we might be focused on meeting the needs of the other party, but we're not meeting our own needs. So it's the flip side, if you like, of that fixed pie mindset. So being very aware of those mindsets and know that you have to both collaborate and compete in a negotiation is really important. So trying to work out what the balance of those two things might be is if you like, part of the art and of undertaking a negotiation. So the second mistake would be around taking risks. So again, when you look at TV shows, it appears negotiators are often doing stuff on gut instinct. They're taking risks and they're winning sort of through the process of taking sort of risks. But in fact, again, the research tells us good negotiators are meticulous planners, and it's all about taking risk out of play before you even get to the negotiating table, and then thinking consciously again about what new risks might emerge as you're working through the negotiation and trying to take them out of play. So risk is the enemy of good negotiation and getting sort of good outcomes in negotiation. And the last one is around making assumptions about what people's, I suppose, intentions or motivations might be. So when we hear something or see the way that somebody behaves, we often assume a set of intentions or motivations behind what they've said or done. But again, that's an assumption. We've got to test that assumption. There might be completely different sort of motivations, and those motivations really, again, get to the heart of underlying interests. So don't make assumptions about what people might be doing and why they might be actually doing it. So they'd be the top sort of three, I reckon, you could go with.
So how do you then prepare yourself? So, for example, and I guess there's a couple, because there's different types of negotiations. There are negotiations you do as you're negotiating a contract, an employment contract or a renewal of it. Then there are negotiations that you have when you're within the workplace with your colleagues, when you're determining all those types of things. So keeping that in mind, how should an individual prepare themselves for what they know will be a tricky negotiation?
Yeah, well, I think a fundamental thing is sort of, accepting that the dynamic in play, typically with negotiations, and especially in workplace context, but also others, is that there are conflicts. And the reality is that, and again, research bears this out, is that most people hate conflict. They'd rather sort of hide under a warm, cuddly blanket than confront a conflict and deal with sort of the issues that might sort of arise in the conflict. So if you're going into a negotiation and you're uncomfortable with conflict, that sort of shows in a number of ways. Like it sort of shows visually, the other party reads it, and in a sense, it affects your credibility in the negotiation. But also if you're uncomfortable with conflict, then it affects the way you think and process information in a negotiation. So it affects your decision-making. So you've got to sort of start by being happy to work with conflict or being prepared to work with conflict. And I think that does come with experience, and often even, when you get to manage the emotions and other bits and pieces that come with conflict situations, and when you're good at doing it, you still feel sort of things inside. It's a bit like synchronized swimming. There's a lot going on underneath, but actually learning how to regulate your response to conflict and the emotions that go with it is really important for the way that you behave and think in a negotiation and the way that you're sort of perceived. So preparing yourself for the nature of the conflict in play, I think, is a really important sort of part of it. The second bit, though, I reckon is, it's almost about being investigative, like an investigator on a crime scene. So you're often working with hypotheses around what might be important. You can identify different options, and you want to work with those as hypotheticals, because that creates a bit of distance between the people involved and, I suppose, concern about where the outcome might sort of land, because you're dealing in the world of hypotheticals. And it allows you to test, if you like, sort of what is the relative importance of different issues, where trade-offs might happen, and so on. So beginning to work around those hypotheticals tends to be very important. And the last bit here is a golden rule that sort of comes through, again, time and time again, across sort of a range of different types of research. And it's called the if-then rule. So it's tied to this idea of hypotheticals, and it's based around the idea that when we're sort of making a concession or making a claim, it's always in the context of, if I'm prepared to do this, then in return, I'm expecting something back. So it sort of sets up this climate, if you like, of trading and reciprocity. So sort of creating that can be a very important thing that sets the, if you like, the climate and the feel of the negotiation.
Oh, Justine.
Well, I've got a question myself, but also Badru, our very expert questioner from the audience, has a question. But shall we, I wonder if we might throw to Badru and then go back to you and I. How's that, Alison?
Yep.
So Badru, welcome
Hello, everyone.
again.
Can you hear me? Nice to see you all. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, awesome. So the question that I posed is pretty much straightforward. I would assume that if you're doing your homework, then you decide ahead how much leeway you can give. Like, shall I give 2 candies instead of 3 or whatever? But sometimes during the course of the conversation, you may feel that you've been put on the spot and a scenario you didn't think of. And it may be a situation where you have to answer or where you have to come to an agreement. And then how can you best deal with it? Like, how can you excuse yourself or basically buy time nicely?
Great question. And I think it's by asking questions. So if it's a scenario that you hadn't anticipated, you know, is it because you were focused on trying to set up a demand or set of positions that you would work with, without thinking through what might be some of the underlying interests or needs that were being met by that, but could be met in many different ways by some alternative set of options that are sort of put on the table? Or is it revealing new information to you about what the other party wants or what their needs are that you need to now incorporate on the run in terms of what you do? So you're right, negotiation's about improvising through much of that sort of process. And I think then once that signal comes through by way of new information, then it's also an opportunity to ask, well, what does this new information mean? What does it mean for my understanding, my prior beliefs about what it is that's in play in the negotiation and what's important to the other side? So asking questions about, well, why is that an important sort of issue to you? What does that solve for you that I don't fully understand? So sort of asking these more open questions that are about trying to get to those underlying sort of things then gives you some space, I reckon, to be able to begin to craft sort of things together. I reckon there are very few situations where you do have to make decisions on the spot, right? So if you're, in a sense, caught off guard by that sort of new information, you know, the idea that you might say, well, this is new information to me, and I need to think about its implications, is something you can bring into play. So I'll take it on notice, you know, and then we can sort of explore it even further. But I wouldn't lead with that. I think the thing to lead with is this probing, these exploratory questions to understand exactly why this new bit of information is so important. And then sort of work it from there in terms of what you think it means for the issues that you're negotiating around. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. You're right. Like, if the information is new, then you can definitely say that. Like, look, I wasn't aware of this, or this is new, for sure. But no, thank you. This is great stuff, applicable to everything in life.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question which isn't on the questions we gave you, which is sort of taking a step back, in that in architecture, often things proceed very, very informally, certainly in smaller practices. And so sometimes there's not even the space for a negotiation. So I guess the question is, and I suppose this is probably more relevant for employees than employers, but if often there's just a sort of cozy assumption that everything will continue. So how do you make space for negotiation if you feel like that space isn't there in a kind of very informal workplace environment?
Well, I suppose you create space by calling it as an issue, making it an issue. So you almost need to problematize what's sort of being proposed or what's sort of part of the accepted way of sort of doing things, and sort of I suppose there beginning to offer or proffer alternative ways of actually doing things, running them. So you begin to open up sort of the space for negotiation by having alternatives or options that might equally sort of work compared to the sort of thing that might be proposed. What would be a good example of that, Justine?
A good example, I'm happy to jump in. So a good example would be, and this is smaller practices where someone might be pulling together to put in a tender for a bid or a competition, and there is an assumption that everybody will simply work until it's done. Whereas, your employment contract says that, you're working a set amount of time, you get a set remuneration, or that there's time in lieu, but often those things are never discussed or negotiated. There is simply an assumption that you will do the work and you will stay until the work is done. And so I guess it's how do particularly less experienced members of those small teams, how do they get their voices heard and go, actually, I've got an exam tomorrow, I need to go home and study, and often they won't do that for fear of losing their jobs.
Yeah, well, it's sort of
being seen as not a team player, the kind of that broader.
Well, and I suppose the professional cultures sort of raise this sort of issue all the time. Architects, lawyers, probably accounting firms, certainly consulting firms and so on. It's a really tricky one, particularly when you are sort of in an early phase of your career and, there's often a great deal demanded of you, long working days, etc. And you have sort of limited sort of discretion. Well, if that sort of thing is coming up regularly, then perhaps outside of a particular event or moment where you're responding, if you like, immediately to an incident, then perhaps you need to initiate a discussion about managing these different types of things. So it's not tied to a specific moment, if you like. So trying to make it more general and abstract. So you're focusing on the issues, not on the immediate type of event. And I suppose when you often focus on those immediate events, it's easy for the sense of difference to be personalized. And I think rather than sort of the focus on the issue. So that might be one way to actually sort of deal with it. Are there other ways to sort of propose, well, I can stay tonight, but tomorrow I've got to study. So it might be that there's, again, that if-then rule. How do you invoke that if-then rule to try to sort of signal that these other things that are in play? But I would recognise as well that particularly now, I would imagine, sort of with the devastating effects of COVID on the job market, that this is a pretty hard thing to do. And I would sort of suggest that in this climate, you might want to think twice about the extent to which you're able to sort of do it. But I'd be also thinking in the longer term and maybe there aren't that many choices, I don't know, about sort of architecture, but is this the sort of workplace I want to work in? So do I begin cultivating my alternatives to a negotiated agreement sort of based on some of that sort of experience? The last thing I'd say, so my background, like Alison, sort of comes out of industrial relations, employment relations as well. So there are unions that cover sort of architects. I think, is it Professionals Australia or Professional Services Australia?
Yeah.
So, you know, I'd be thinking, well, should I be a member of a collective organisation that can represent my interests when it comes to this? So again, I'm not the one who's immediately in the firing line in my sort of workplace, because I'm the one who complains, I'm the one who raises the sort of issue. And that's the whole point of unions, is about sort of collectivising, if you like, sort of voice, and creating some form of protection for individuals who would otherwise cop it, if you like, for being the voice for concerns that might be more general amongst a particular sort of collective.
Mm.
So I recognise it's a really hard situation because of that power difference, because of the context, but there are some things you can think about what you might sort of do by way of negotiation, but also other things as well.
Mm. I've got an example myself, actually, of my own workplace years and years ago, where the only time pay was ever discussed when I was told I had a pay rise of a certain amount, you know, not fairly infrequently, but there was no space for any discussion. It was just like, you're getting this much more. And one time I said to them, so how does that compare with others? And they went, well, you're in the right place. And I actually knew how much someone else was earning, which I thought was not an appropriate relationship. So, but I was such a sook, I never said anything. But we've got a good question here from Ike, which is building on this, but in a kind of relation to negotiating fees with clients. So I think one argument I'd make is we need to be good negotiators, not just for our own workplace conditions, but also within the kind of broader industry. So Ike, do you want to put your question? Are you there? No?
No, sorry, Ike's got kids.
Ike's got kids, okay. Well, what Ike says is another example would be negotiating fee variations with clients, especially when work is already informally proceeded due to the project program. So how does, and like, this is a, you know, a continual problem that architects bring up is their inability to manage fees and fee negotiations very effectively. So I wonder if you've got, if you have, is it the same question, or do you have some further tips in that kind of other professional situation?
So on the wage thing that you raised there as well, Justine, I'd say
just skipped over that, right?
Yeah, but I think I can relate it back to like sort of negotiating sort of fees with clients and so on. So really the best time to actually negotiate what your salary is to be is at the start of the contract, or before, you know, before you sort of fully sign on the dotted line, right? So there's got to be sort of, if you like, some uncertainty about the outcome for you to have leverage in that sort of process. So the best time is before you say, yes, I would love to take the job. You can say, yes, I'll take the job, but there are some issues we need to discuss and resolve to make sure that it sort of works for me. And your wage and other entitlements will be one of that. And it might be, for instance, looking at sort of working hours. I can you know, I can work sort of these longer hours to meet sort of the needs of clients, but keep in mind I'm also studying, so I need to take into account those. And this is how I would propose taking those things into account. So that can happen right before you know, as part of that initial negotiation. That's the best time. You can't leave it for 6 months or 12 months after you've started to say, well, actually, I think I'm worth more. Like, I think, you know, basically I need a different sort of set of conditions. You don't have sort of leverage, but you've already agreed to the terms on which you've sort of taken up that sort of employment. So you're not in a particularly sort of strong position to be able to do it anyway, unless certain things have changed, which give you space to begin to introduce some sort of other issues. And there again, keep in mind this idea of sort of what's in it for the other party by agreeing to some variation that you're sort of proposing. And I think there's sort of something there surely around sort of negotiating with sort of clients. So your best chance to get sort of, if you like, sort of an appropriate structure for client fees is before, you know, as you're both sort of agreeing to the terms of engagement sort of with an architect. And having sort of had a personal experience or experiences with a couple of architects from a client sort of perspective, the fact that things are not that specified or clear is problematic as well. So in terms of that particular sort of setup, it's the architect who's coming to the negotiation with more knowledge, repeat experience, and an understanding of all the things that might go wrong and might require variations and so on. Whereas from a client perspective, even if you've negotiated other things before, you're coming into that situation as a bit of a greenhorn, without that experience, without in that specific sort of context, to be able to understand what all those issues might be. So in fact, I would say, sort of as an architect, beyond your professional obligations, if you want a deal that sticks and one that works well, you've got to sort of anticipate where some of those variations might happen, and you've got to be able to inform your client that that's a possibility, and if it happens, this is the way we would respond to them. So it's sort of having that degree of disclosure up front, but making sure the terms of what is agreed actually anticipate some of those events that may not happen, but you can, with if you like, a reasonable outlook, anticipate that they could happen. So it needs to be a deal that will terms of understanding or agreement that actually can anticipate those shocks and can shift with them. So that would be one thing I would sort of keep in mind, I suppose, about how you might deal with sort of clients on that front.
One of the things, Peter, that we're really interested to have a bit of a focus on is around different negotiating styles and confidences. And I guess it's also speaking to difference. So gender difference, cultural difference in terms of negotiation. So, there's this widespread idea that women on a whole as a group are not such strong negotiators, or that they accept, that they're conciliatory, so they accept things. And so, but that at the same time, they can also be very strong negotiators when negotiating for other people as opposed to themselves. So I'm just wondering, if you want to talk a little bit to that gender, we had a conversation about this last week, and it was really interesting what you were saying. So do you want to talk a little bit around that gender difference and in terms of negotiating?
So there are some differences that sort of come through the research between men and women in a number of sort of respects. First of all, in terms of their stylistic tendency. So there's a whole bunch of research that looks at styles of conflict management and negotiation. And I suppose the two sort of contrasting styles are around being competitive and being a problem solver. And so again, women are more likely to fall into the problem-solving style, whereas men are more likely to be competitive in negotiations. Women are also more likely to be conflict avoiders in conflict situations and negotiations than men. But that's actually a contingent type of finding. There are a couple of great experiments done by one of the leading sort of scholars in the field of negotiations called Lee Thompson, where she ran these experiments where she had men and women negotiating with each other and in repeated rounds. And so she tried a couple of different things. One was where she basically had a male-female dyad competing, negotiating against each other, and everything else being equal, the other things that might explain how people perform in negotiation, generally women performed worse than men in terms of getting good outcomes in negotiation. But then when she showed those results to the women in the experiment, and they then negotiated a second round, but with another randomly selected male dyad, they actually outperformed the men. So just knowing that there was that tendency led women to negotiate more effectively. She also did the same sort of experiment with giving them some basic training, like, about how to negotiate well. And she found that those gender differences tended to disappear with sort of that very small intervention around sort of negotiating. On the issue of negotiating for others, in fact, that's true for both men and women. So basically, we are generally really bad negotiators on our own behalf. And it's because we've got skin in the game, it means that we do it in a more emotionally sort of heightened state. and it affects what psychologists call our cognitive load. So when we get emotional, our brain is is using its resources, its energy to process, regulate emotions, not for thinking, not for the cognitive process that you need to process information and make good decisions. So when we're negotiating on our behalf, our cognitive load is focused on the emotional side of things, not the thinking side of things. So when you're negotiating for somebody else, though, you tend to not wear the emotional baggage of the situation. And so more of your cognitive load is focused, in fact, on the outcome. And you're less risk averse. So you're more risk averse generally when you're doing things on your own. And the more important the issue, the stronger these effects are. So again, I think what that tells us is that you can use that, that experience of negotiating for others and to consciously think about the emotional dimension of a conflict situation. And again, experience is a great teacher of how to manage emotionally charged situations. But to the extent that you're consciously thinking about the need to regulate those emotions and regulate self, you can overcome some of that problem that you might have in the way you do it. One of the second big things that comes through some of the research is that there are gender differences in goal aspirations. And this might be related to the stronger tendency for women to have this conflict avoidance style as opposed to dealing with the conflict. And even if they don't, they tend to, and particularly when they're working to negotiate on their own behalf, they set less aspirational goals. So men are more likely to set more aspirational goals in the process. So again, once you, and Lee Thompson's work tells us this, once you reveal that bit of information and make it a conscious process of setting goals, women do better in negotiation. So actually learning from your experience negotiating for others, thinking about some of those trait-like things and bringing that into focus. I suppose it's a form of leaning in, if you want a term to, that's there in some of the literature about how women can deal with workplace issues. I think it's a little bit more than just leaning in. It's just being conscious of those biases that tend to be there and confronting them in the way you do things. And I suppose in terms of this, going back to Justine's point about asking for a pay rise, I actually reckon that, most people are reluctant to ask for pay rises. It's true, men are more likely to ask for pay rises than women, but we overestimate the negative response that we might get when we ask those sorts of questions. So we assume the worst, whereas in fact, it may not be such a threatening thing to ask. I think I'm worth more. Well, if you think you're worth more, actually, you should go into that discussion with a clear idea about the ways in which you are worth more than you're currently paid. I mean, if it's just doing your job and doing it well on terms that you've agreed to, I would say that's not enough. You need to be able to go into a negotiation saying, well, this is what I bring to the party. If you pay me more, this is what, I expect to be able to contribute to my role. And maybe it's partly about also having some expanded set of responsibilities or taking on, if you like, some other task that is important to the organisation as part of that if-then type rule that you go with. So don't be afraid, I reckon, to ask for a pay rise, ask for those things, but keep in mind that there's got to be a value proposition for the other party in the deal as well.
Okay, we've got some other good questions here. There's Elise Maynard. Do you want to ask your question about how you hold people to account to things that they have agreed to and may have then just managed to forget?
Yeah.
Elise. Elise here?
Oh.
Is Elise here, or shall we? Okay, I'm going to ask it for.
You can't at the moment.
Okay. Well. Okay. I suppose it is a problem, a common problem when I suppose you've got verbal agreements in play. And, I suppose it's a matter of, well, for me, it's a matter of habits. It's a matter of recording what's agreed to, but it's also a matter of clarifying and confirming. So just to confirm, we've just agreed to this. Is my understanding correct? Have I got it right? you know, and making sure, if you like, that it's sort of stated, emphasized, and keeping a record. And perhaps after a negotiation saying, look, I just thought I would record, I thought I'd sort of make sure I understood what we'd agreed to, and in dot points say, this is the agreement. So actually making a record of what was agreed to, sharing it with the other party, asking for their confirmation that this is what was actually agreed to. Now that doesn't overcome the problem, which, you know, is a pain in the butt, I know, but it happens, is where you can have these sort of discussions, and it often comes up talking about team conflicts as well, where you have a discussion, you think you've agreed, you go away, and before you know it, hours afterwards, somebody says, well, I'm not sure that's going to work, what we agreed to. I'm sort of going to take things in a different direction. So it means it's not concluded. So you've got to go back and sort of rework it. But I actually think having a record for your own sake, but for the other parties, but also in that process of confirmation, again, that this is what we agreed, and it signals a degree of commitment, if you like, to sort of what it was that was actually agreed.
We've also got a really good question from Alice Edmonds, which I think shifts on to some other questions that we might want to ask too. So Alice, are you able to ask your question, or have you also got...
I'm here. I don't have kids.
Hi, Alice.
Yeah, no, I was just interested. I guess it always has struck me as quite a one-style way of negotiating, and can be kind of almost a little aggressive, I would say. But not that it has to be that way, and toxic. And I'm just wondering, is there any room for vulnerability and honesty in negotiations?
This is a really good question. Thank you for asking this. I think there actually sort of is. And there is sort of this debate in the literature about a couple of things. One is, when you're negotiating and in that exploratory phase, what do you lead with? Okay, first of all, are you the first to sort of try to mark out a claim, if you like, sort of, or propose what the deal should be, or particularly around sort of core issues, so that you anchor the negotiation? And there are these anchoring effects that you try to create as part of that sort of process. And the second, if you like, sort of debate, for want of a better term, is, what do you lead with? Do you lead with your weaknesses or your strength? Again, I suppose there are different sort of views on this, but often there's one of the arguments that sort of supports the idea that actually putting on the table what might be vulnerabilities or weaknesses in your position in a negotiation can also help you begin to frame the negotiation. So placing those in a context, being clear about, if you like, sort of how you might sort of see those vulnerabilities or those points of weakness in your position as part of a larger story. So again, you can anchor them. It also signals your authenticity, your honesty in the process, and it helps overcome what's often referred to as the negotiator's dilemma. And the negotiator's dilemma is basically, we're caught in this problem of trust and honesty. So how much can I trust what the other party is telling me is true, or not just a load of fake news, for want of a better term, that they're using to construct their position? And how much information should I share? What should I share in a way that, in fact, you know, I can signal my underlying concerns and interests, but at the same time don't leave myself vulnerable to being sort of played with in an opportunistic sort of way. What this sort of suggests is that you need to do some of these things in incremental ways. So you share some information, you're expecting some in return, and you're building reciprocity, you're building openness and honesty in the sort of process. When you lead with aspects that include your vulnerabilities or weaknesses of your position, what adds to that is that you're being upfront. So the trust issue becomes less of a barrier to trying to work sort of through things. I'm not saying you put it all on the table straight away. I'm suggesting you need to think about how you can do that incrementally so that you can solicit or elicit, if you like, something in return by way of disclosure and honesty about sort of the other party's position as well. So it's an improvised process perhaps in the negotiation that depends on what you experience with the other party. But it is an important part of the process to help anchor and frame things, but also to overcome this dilemma.
Awesome.
Yes.
I can just keep asking questions, but I thought you might.
No, well, I had, and this is sort of follows on a little bit from that, quite a specific question, which we'd flagged earlier, which is, should you lie?
Oh, gee, Alison, nice question. Dorothy Dixer, this one.
Dorothy Dixer.
So in some ways, like you're caught between two things. I've just spoken sort of in response to Alice's question there about the importance of framing sort of your position in a negotiation. So framing is the idea that we're trying to set up a narrative, a bit of a story around what's going on, how the issues relate to each other, how it can serve both our interests, and why you should be sort of accepting the way that I'm interpreting and thinking about the negotiation. It helps sets up the trade-offs and other sorts of things. Now that's in a sense, it's a form of manipulation in the process. And it feels like it can be a blurry line between that process of framing where we're emphasizing things that are more advantageous to us and being deceptive and lie. But in fact, there is a difference between the two, and everyone sort of negotiators, experienced negotiators, will tell you they're pretty clear about the difference between the two. Emphasizing certain things, framing things in that way doesn't involve telling porcupines, okay? They're off the table. The reason why they're off the table is because we're working in small professional communities. So you've got a reputation, right? So, and once you get a reputation for telling fibs, then that goes with you. Like it will influence your ability to prosecute negotiations into the future. We're also susceptible to another cognitive bias, which is basically a we're in control bias. So we're more likely to think of ourselves as being in control of a situation than we actually are. But the reality is with a negotiation, both parties are working with incomplete understanding of all the issues, all the stuff that's sort of going on. So we make assumptions, and it gives us this sense of, if you like, control and understanding. But when we start lying, then it just takes some astute probing, some astute questioning, and perhaps drawing on information that is inconsistent with our assumptions, where the other party can begin to, if you like, uncover things. And you find yourself, once you start with fibs or lies in a negotiation, you have to tell more lies to construct the story through that sort of process. So a good negotiator will find you out, not by calling you a liar. You will rarely, if ever, see that in a negotiation. And it's often a problem when negotiators are negotiating on behalf of a client. The clients, they're saying, that's a lie. I want you to call that person out for lying. Whereas the negotiator's thinking, look, it might be a lie, but let's not focus on it as a lie. Let's focus on the issues and the outcomes we're trying to get to. We can use questions and probing to sort of begin to unpack it and use that in a more subtle way to help reframe it. But if we're the one lying, then we end up finding ourselves in all sorts of twists and turns in that sort of process. So again, the research, experimental sort of studies where they use these randomized sort of experiments, vignettes and exercises, show that where people lie in negotiations, they actually generally do worse in a negotiation. So it doesn't help you, it doesn't help your reputation. It's just, as well as being unethical, like instrumentally, it's bad, right? It doesn't generally work, and ethically, it's sort of compromising.
And so I'm just picking up, because Bhadra's come in with a question around this. Do you want to ask it, Bhadra, around the, yeah.
Hello again, everyone. So not telling is not lying. I think I've heard that ever since I became a teenager. Anyway,
That's not what my mum said.
So that's a question that I've often asked myself, even for life things, not just work. Like, where do you draw the line between what you're not legally bound to disclose, between ethics and holding some information that gives you an advantage in the negotiation? because ultimately the goal is to win the negotiation. So, or not win, maybe a right word, but sort of, you know, sort of maybe just do well for ourselves, something like that. Yeah.
Okay, so a couple of things. First of all, your goal is to certainly do well for yourself, but it's not to win. That's the fixed mindset I was talking about before.
Yes.
Your job often is a painful one as a negotiator. It's often to help the other party out, to help them realize goals and outcomes that they want to achieve. And by doing so, you can often make yourself better off. Now, sometimes it feels painful, it's frustrating, it takes a lot of effort, but that's actually the task of a good negotiator, is to work through that sort of process. So there's that. The second thing is if we fail to disclose things, it's a live omission as opposed to a live commission. If we fail to disclose something, and in the end, if you like, the deal is dependent on that omitted bit of information, and then it becomes sort of known, but in fact, the implementation of the deal on an ongoing basis is reliant on cooperation with the other party, then you're in a bit of a bind again. So it's where your live omission might in fact come back to, and this is a technical term, come back to bite you on the bum. So you want to avoid those sort of situations. Now, I would recognize that there's a fine line between my response earlier, I think, to, I've forgotten who it was, somebody's question around, I think it was Alice's question around, do you disclose your weaknesses and so on? And I was suggesting, particularly early in a negotiation, you're disclosing little by little to get that sort of reciprocity to come through, or to be part of what it is that you're building to create a good climate for negotiations and a good sort of outcome. I think by the end of the negotiation, information that's pertinent to the outcome should be disclosed. Like, it should be part of the picture so that both parties, for it really to be a win-win or an integrative sort of outcome, then all of those things need to be on the table so that they're taken into account, and you're getting the best deal possible. You might also find that by not disclosing certain information, you're sort of narrowing possibilities that might have emerged out of discussion of that bit of information. You might see it as a weakness, but in fact, it might turn out to be pertinent to be able to explore different options that you've not actually thought about. So I think there are a range of reasons why, just like lies of commission, lies of omission shouldn't be sort of part of the repertoire. They shouldn't be part of your tactical repertoire in a negotiation.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Peter, it's a question we did send through to you earlier, and it's a question from an employer perspective, which is, what can employers do? And this is a very general thing, because, you know, in within the architectural industry, you know, you've got employers who are, you know, very small practices right up to very huge global organisations. But basically, what can employers do to ensure that there is a level playing field for negotiations with staff, and to ensure that some of those gender biases that we reflected on earlier aren't in play? So what can employers do to set up equal opportunities for everybody in any negotiation that exists within the workplace?
Okay. Well, it will depend on the issue, I think, in terms of what specifically you might sort of do. But if we think about it in terms of like a team sort of context where sort of you're trying to work through sort of issues, I would have thought, given what we've been talking about and what we sort of know makes for effective negotiations, you actually want your people to actually have some fundamental skills to manage conflict and to do negotiation. Because you get better outcomes, you'll get better outcomes if you do that. What we know from the team literature, it's different from the negotiation sort of research, is that generally teams are affected by there are others, but two core types of conflict. The first is task conflict. So who does what, when, and how type of sort of questions. The second are interpersonal bases of conflict. So I don't like Alison because she's got funny glasses, say. But that's not true, of course. But that would be a sort of a silly example of like an interpersonal conflict. What we know is that where teams have interpersonal conflicts, they're destructive, period. So there's no exception to them not being sort of destructive. They lead to bad relationships, bad team climate, less cooperation, and less productive teams. But where teams have at least a moderate level of task conflict, it tends to be good for the team. It actually improves relationships, often deals with problems. You're able to come up with more creative solutions to things and so on. The problem is that often task-based conflict turns into interpersonal conflict. So good managers should be trying to avoid that transition of conflict from being task-based to being interpersonal in nature. And so I think just having some good negotiation skills might be important for avoiding that sort of outcome. I think in terms of the broader issue that you raised there about sort of equal opportunities and so on, it requires sort of structural responses to things. It requires that sort of in firms, you've got women who are team leaders, not just, if you like, sort of team members. You need sort of women in managerial sort of positions to sort of make that happen. You might want to sort of set up where you've got more formal processes for dealing with conflict and negotiation, certain elements in those that are really about addressing those sorts of issues. So again, it would, I think, depend on the specific, if you like, sort of industry practice or cultural sort of context that might be evident in architecture firms. And to be honest, I don't know that much about what happens inside sort of architecture firms, but you would need some of those things to reflect, if you like, sort of those practices and problems, those specific problems that they may have. So it feels like this is as much a structural problem as a way in which you might sort of negotiate things.
One of the things, I can't recall where I read, but something along the lines of, again, these are kind of broad generalizations, but, you know, women as a group tend to do better in negotiations when there are kind of clear structures or systems or, you know, pay, whatever they're called, bands in relation to specific roles, and architecture often has none of that. So I've always wondered if just having more clarity around role expectations and the kinds of salaries that go with those particular expectations would also perhaps benefit that group of women who do conform to that sort of pattern.
No, it's an interesting observation. I think sort of at least the more general research in sort of industrial relations and human resource management that I'm sort of familiar with. So typically where there are sort of components of pay, for example, that are performance-based, men are more likely to be rated sort of as higher performing than women, everything else sort of being equal. And when they're rated the same, women are generally given a differential type of reward, if you like, for that performance sort of effect. So men are more likely, for example, to be promoted. Women are more likely to get sort of, you know, perhaps a training opportunity or a one-off sort of pay rise. So it has no sort of, if you like, cumulative effect over time.
Right.
So,
yeah.
So that's sort of
That's how we get things like pay gaps. They just build on top of each other.
They are cumulative. So there is this sort of research in the pay area that looks at what's called pay transparency. It's an American sort of body of work because there, I suppose, there's very little regulation of wages at all. And there's certainly no requirement. And in fact, as part of your contract of employment in many large US companies, you're forbidden from disclosing your own pay to other work colleagues. Yep. So it's intended to create these sort of, I suppose, silos between people to prevent comparison. So that you might say, well, that's not fair. You know, Alison's getting paid 20% more than I am, but I'm sitting right next to her and we're doing the same job, type of thing. Whereas here in Australia, we've got more regulation, but we're saying in sort of professional practice, there's less by way of that structure of if you like, pay grades and so on. But generally, we don't see this wage transparency or pay transparency issue as a big one here because of the more extensive regulation that's there. But it would seem to me that this is a good practice, right? So from a sort of an equity sort of point of view, that there is pay transparency within firms. Maybe we could start a campaign for architecture firms to have full pay transparency from the CEO.
Yes,
I'm
indeed.
happy to join.
Excellent. One of the many things Parla needs to do. I've had someone contact me suggesting a session of these around salaries and pay transparency and things like that. So hopefully we will get a chance to dig deeper into that shortly. In architecture, we do have minimums up to registration thanks to the award, but after that, it's just a big free for all. And many contracts do require people not to disclose their salary to their colleagues. So there's lots of work to do on that. We have got, I know it's time to finish and I'm terrible at going over time. We've got a question from a couple of people asking about if you've got recommendations for training that people can do around better dealing with conflict.
Feels like a paid commercial sort of now. So in fact, on October 12th, I'll be it'll be the first day of a 2-week micro-credential in effective negotiation. This was totally unplanned, by the way, people. We weren't planning
We
this.
had no idea.
If you go to the University of Melbourne website and look up effective negotiation microcert, then you'll be able to find details for that. That might be sort of one way to do it. So again, the research looks at how people improve negotiation. So there are 3 things that sort of come through from the research generally. Doing formal training programs actually has a big effect, but it doesn't have a continuous effect, right? So you learn things, you learn techniques, you get ideas, and then it will have like an effect on how well you negotiate, but it's hard to build on it without some other sorts of things. And the other 2 things are experience. So not avoiding negotiation or conflict, but if you like, using every opportunity to negotiate. So in my graduate class in negotiation, one of the first exercises that people have to do is they have to find an everyday task that they do that they would otherwise sort of accept. So if it was going to, I don't know, Victoria Markets to buy a flathead, they have to turn it into a negotiation. If they have to book a hotel room, they have to come back and say they got a consent. They've got to work out how they're able to negotiate a better deal than what was on the table in the first place. So doing that as practice turns out to be really important, throwing yourself into situations where you get to experience negotiations of different varieties. And the third is also having goals around your own development. So being reflective about where you think your relative strengths and weaknesses are, and having almost like a personal development plan that sort of identifies the ways in which you specifically want to improve your ability to negotiate. So in fact, the formal training thing, you can come along if you want, but that's only one thing. That's only one bit of the story. These other 2 things are about growth, right? They're about growth over time. So having those in place as more conscious things, again, the research evidence tells us leads to people improving more as negotiators.
Right. Well, I think we
So,
need to...
Peter, I was just going to say, Peter, this was a bit, we did rehearse earlier, which is, are there any resources that people can just pick up or, jump online and purchase?
You might see up here, I've got sort of a line of negotiation books sort of up there. There's an old favourite there called Getting to Yes. So that was written in 1982 by 2 Harvard academics. Do you know what? That book is still a golden truth. Like, it's a great book, and in some ways it's the birth of modern negotiation theory. There is sort of a longer, more updated sort of book. I hate the title of this book, but I love the book. It's one of my favourite books on negotiations. It's called Negotiation Genius. What a terrible title. What were they thinking? And it's by Deepak Malhotra and one of my intellectual heroes, Max Bazerman. So Bazerman and Malhotra are the authors of that sort of book. I can hand those details sort of on to Justine and Alison, and you can get that. But that's a great book. It's an update. It's got sort of much more contemporary research and so on.
Great. And we've had a question further back from Tanya saying she'd love to know some of the references to the research that you were mentioning too. If we can prevail on you, although, you know.
Virtual library, yeah, we'll make one.
Wonderful, great. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Peter. I think we do a little virtual clap for you now. So,
Thank you.
There was lots of nodding and note-taking, which I always think is a very good sign. Alison, do you want to say something?
I'll just note that Tanya has popped up. Thank you, Tanya Davidge. You're not on my screen, but I know you're there. Tanya has popped up in the chat the link to the course at Melbourne Uni.
Oh.
Thanks, Tanya.
Great. Well, again, we can put together a little package of things. Something else in terms of this idea of kind of, you know, practicing and growth, and I think I've mentioned previously, Margaret Devlin, who did a really great session with us a couple of weeks ago, has been offering some group online coaching. You will have seen notices to that. The first session of those is all booked out. But Margaret has also agreed to offer a second session. So when I have a moment, probably over the weekend, I will put links up on the website to that, and also send out an email alert. So for those of you who missed out on that first, that booking for that first session, we are going to be doing some more. And I think that might help us with that continual sort of practicing of these things. I certainly need to practice negotiation. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everybody. Who knows what's happening next week? I've sent out a couple of emails to possible speakers, so we'll have something for you. I don't know what it will be yet, but it will be good. Have a lovely weekend, everybody.